This is a hybrid of slide plus Blackboard talk. Don't on the slide. Okay, so basically I wrote down some history, etc. I hope it's not too distracting. This is going to take too much time to write, but it's in some sense simple to talk about, not too much to absorb. So I thought this would be a better use of time to sort of just go through it somewhat faster than what it would take to write it down together with Steve. Okay, so I can begin that. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about why approximating constraint satisfaction problems requires sub-exponential size linear programs. Okay, and this is joint work with Raghumeka from UCLA and Prasad Raghvendra from UC Berkeley. Okay, so let me start by telling you what the main result of this work is. We're going to show that if you take any 2 to the n to the c size linear program, and you can think of c as 0.001, it's in quotes because I don't know the exact constant, but it's some universal constant. So if you take a 2 to the n to the c size linear program relaxation for any constraint satisfaction problem, then it has the following integrality gap. For example, and I'm only going to say examples, the real statement would follow later on in the talk. But these are like three corollaries that I'm stating here. So if you want to approximate max cut with a 2 to the n to the c size linear program, then you're gonna suffer an integrality gap of at least 2. For max 3 sat, you're going to suffer an integrality gap of at least 8 over 7. And similarly for max 2 sat, you will suffer an integrality gap of at least 4/3. And if these numbers look weird, let me just demystify them. These are numbers which basically are the approximation ratios of a very simple algorithm which simply returns a random assignment as the answer to the constraint satisfaction problem. In particular, if you return a random cut, then you know it's a true approximation or half approximation depending on how you see it. And basically what we are saying is that even a sub-exponential size linear program doesn't beat this trivial algorithm that simply returns a random assignment. Okay. And the other results are analogous. Okay, so you would ask, why should we care about such a result at all? And in some sense, the question is valid because if you assume, for example, that NP has no small circuits, NP doesn't have, for example, no polynomial size circuits, then at least for max 3 sat and max 2 sat, the result I stated follow immediately, just because we know that distinguishing between, let's say, a 7 over 8 satisfiable 3 sat instance versus a completely satisfiable 3 sat instance is NP. And in some sense, therefore, the main appeal of these results is that they are unconditional. They are not going to depend on any assumptions such as NP not in P/1. More importantly, linear programming is a powerful tool which has actually often led to extremely clever and fast algorithms for many problems in approximation algorithms. And therefore, such a result serves as, in some sense, a sobering attempt at understanding exactly what are the limitations of this really powerful technique that we use so often. And at least in this one corollary that I have already stated here, we see that something slightly surprising depending on where you come from is already happening, in that you know that for max cut, there is a simple 0.878 approximation to the famous Bowman-Williamson semi-definite program relaxation, which is a really small and simple SDP. And what this result is saying is that even a sub-exponential size linear program doesn't beat the performance of this simple, small semi-definite program. So it's an exponential separation between the power of linear programming relaxation and semi-definite programming relaxations. Okay? So, proving integrality gap for linear programming relaxations is not at all a new attempt. In fact, we've been doing it for decades now. And in the beginning, the idea was that linear programming relaxation for yeah.
Can you raise this board any higher?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should have
Heads.
Is this better?
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the benefit of writing.
Maybe even slightly higher for people farther back. Does it go? Does it?
Is this visible to everyone?
Look, is there any reason it doesn't go 6 inches higher?
No, you want to.
That's great. Thank you.
Now you can't point to the top.
Yeah, that was, but it's okay.
But you weren't pointing anyway.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Just follow along. Okay, so proving integrality gap for linear programming relaxations is not at all a new attempt. And in the beginning, in some sense, what we were trying to do was we came up with relaxation for various problems in a clever way. And then we came up with rounding algorithms but at times we did not know if we should be looking for a better rounding algorithm for the relaxation or not. And lower bounds on integrality gaps basically pointed us towards saying that, you know what, maybe this LP is not the right LP to look at, maybe we should come up with a different relaxation. And in some sense, motivated by such an idea, there were several integrality gaps proven for various specific linear programming relaxations for Wing problems. A systematic attempt, however, to study large classes of linear programs and prove lower bounds for them, lower bounds for the integrality gaps for them, was begun in this really nice paper by Sanjeev, Bolabash and Lowas from 2002. It's called Proving Lower Bounds Without Knowing a Linear Program, which actually, that's what it does. It basically takes a large class of linear programs and shows that none of those classes can beat two approximation for the vertex cover problem. Okay, and it includes the famous, for example, Lowas, Schreiber, hierarchy, etc. Okay, so and basically this work led to an extremely nice sequence of results where we understood many generic or systematic ways of generating more and more powerful linear programming relaxations for various problems. In particular, there was this, so there are methods like, for example, you might have heard of the Sherali-Adams linear programming hierarchy or Lowas-Schreiber linear programming hierarchy. These are methods which take a basic linear programming relaxation for your particular problem, and then they have a mechanical way of generating additional inequalities that are valid for the actual integral solution and can be shown to provably tighten the set, the feasible set that you are actually optimizing on. So in some sense, you would expect that such a procedure would give you more and more power as you add more and more inequality constraints. And so basically these results that showed integrality gaps for Sherali-Adams or Lowas-Schreiber showed that despite these inequalities provably tightening the feasible set, they did not give you an edge in the sense that they did not help you beat some natural integrality gap that you wanted to. Okay? And arguably
I'm just not sure if the first year students might know all the more integrality gaps. I'm not sure. So at least you could define a polytope for the problem, like the relaxation.
Okay, yeah.
Just in there.
Okay, we are actually going to do a specific example,
Okay,
but
okay.
yeah, actually it's just the next step. So maybe we can wait just a moment. Okay, so roughly speaking, before I go ahead, I can point out in the following sense what should you think of integrality gap. So basically, when you write a linear programming relaxation for a problem, you somehow expand. So in general, for example, let's say you are trying to solve the max cut problem, right? Which is an optimization problem over all possible cuts in a graph, right? So one could think of these cuts as corresponding to their indicator vectors, which are in some sense going to be, say, plus minus 1, they would lie in plus minus 1 to the n or 0, 1 to the n, right? So in general, you are trying to optimize over a discrete set, the hypercube. And this is not optimization over such a set is not going to be a small linear program in general. So what you end up doing is you relax this set into a more continuous version of it. So for example, one natural relaxation of the hypercube would be the solid hypercube, where you take the interval 0, 1 to the n. But the issue here is that now you would obtain a fractional solution instead of integral. Like in the solution that your linear programming relaxation returns to you, you would have entries which are strictly between 0, 1 in general. So what you should do at this point is round it, in the sense you go from a fractional solution to an integral solution. An integrality gap basically is a proof that there exists some instance such that there is a feasible, in fact you could show that it is an optimal solution to the linear program, so that if you round it, you would necessarily incur some loss in your approximation. So in other words, with that particular linear programming realization, with whatever rounding scheme you might come up with, you would not be able to obtain an approximation ratio better than the integrality gap of the linear program. Okay? I hope that made a little bit sense. We will go to some specific example in a moment, so hopefully it will make sense. Okay? So coming back, we were talking about these general different project methods like Sherali-Adams or Lowas-Schreiber, and arguably one could say that the ultimate goal of proving lower bounds for many hierarchies of linear programs like this is to show that any tiny linear program, any, let's say, polynomial sized linear program, cannot solve your favorite problem better than some natural integrality gap or natural approximation ratio value. Of course, such a statement immediately hits the snag that you would expect. Because linear programming is P-complete, you would also be showing that NP has no polynomial size circuits if you end up showing such a result. Okay?
You know, that's what I always used to think. I'm not sure it's completely true. I mean, have you ever thought it through? I mean, you know, I even wrote it in a paper and then I realized it was, I don't know how to do it.
So I think the way I thought about it is the following. In some sense, nobody stops you from coming up with the following LP relaxation for, let's say, TSP. Right? Suppose P equals NP, and then you basically construct a reduction from TSP to bipartite matching.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And now you use the bipartite matching LP. Now, is that a linear program for TSP?
Not really.
Why not? If the reduction holds, then you wrote a linear program for TSP, but you shouldn't be able to rule out the size of such a linear program, right?
Yeah, that's what I used to think. Yeah, think through that reduction. I'm not so convinced.
Huh. Okay, yeah, maybe.
It's up to you what define what it means to solve the problem using linear programming. I think that's not.
Yeah, maybe.
You have to have some restricted notion of algorithm that reduces to linear programming, and then it depends on what definition you have.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes.
Maybe a thing of a projection reduction. You know, it needs something more. It's not that, yeah, and I probably could be blamed for having put this in a paper and then.
I think that's definition would give you what Pravesh said.
Like,
So if DC with NP, you would solve in next to the linear program. I think most definitions.
oh, with a linear program, but this is a relaxation.
Yeah, relaxation. Yeah, exactly. If you formalize relaxations, then
Yes.
that's essentially what Yanagata said and what
Yes.
what Pravesh was.
Yeah. So we're gonna see exactly what. Okay. So I think
Just
that's
that statement, yeah, maybe we can
Yes.
discuss offline.
Yes, that's probably a great point, and I'll take back the claim that there is some connection to whatever showing P equals NP. Let's take that offline. Yeah, we don't want to do P versus NP today.
Maybe key not equal.
Oh, P not equal. Yes. Okay. So going back, so basically, one of the things that isn't very well qualified in this main result that comes out from this discussion is what does it mean to say any linear program for constraint satisfaction? And I'm going to tell you what I mean by saying any linear program of 2 to the n to the c size now. Okay? So in particular, we want to understand what do we think of as a linear programming realization for any constraint satisfaction problem. Okay? So let me start by setting some quick notation. A CSP is defined by a predicate. So a predicate P is basically just a k-bit Boolean function. It takes k bit as inputs and output a single bit of output. Okay? Such a problem is defined on n variables, x1, x2, so on up to xn. And these variables can take values in plus minus 1. So each of them takes values in plus minus 1. An instance of a CSP with predicate P is defined by m k-tuples of literals of these variables. So each CI is just a k-tuple where each entry is either a variable or its negation. And your goal is to find x so that the number of i's such that P of Ci of x takes the value 1 is maximized. And if that's like too confusing, this is like really trivial because let's just take an example and which would make all this notation clear. So our favorite problem again is the max cut problem. The predicate P for this problem is the not equal 2-bit predicate. So basically this predicate takes 2 bits as input and returns 1 if the 2 bits are unequal and 0 otherwise. An instance of this problem is defined by a graph. So basically each graph gives you a bunch of edges, which is like pairs of variables. And in this case, we would write g of x to indicate the size of the cut indicated by the vector x. So each x is an element of plus minus 1 to the n. Therefore, it indicates some subset of vertices, and you could think of as any subset of vertices defines a cut. And I would write g of x to denote the size of the cut indicated by x. Okay? Then the optimal or the optimal value of the max cut in this graph is just the maximum over all possible x's in plus minus 1 to dn, so all possible cuts of g of x. Right? This is just notation, but I wanted to go over it because we'll use it again. And then let me just make it clear, when I say size of the cut, I'm normalizing it. So this value will always be between 0 and 1. I'm going to divide by less than the number of edges to ensure this. Okay? So now we come back to the main question that we were at. What do we mean by writing an arbitrary linear program for max cut? So, okay, so now I want to solve this problem. Maximize over the set of all cuts the function g of x. The first issue is that linear programming relaxations maximize a linear function over some polygon. G of x is at least directly a quadratic function of the input x. So what I must do to actually use linear programming is to linearize the objective g of x. Okay? So what do we mean by linearize? Well, for example, one of the basic relaxations that was well studied for max cut is the following linearization, following linear program. What you do is, instead of having a variable for each vertex, as in here, you have a variable ye for every edge in the graph. Right? So ye will take the values 0 or 1, and it indicates whether you want to choose a particular edge or not. And then what you would want to restrict is that ye, the vector y must indicate a set of edges that belong to some cut. Right? So this is some constraint on the kind of 0, 1 vectors that y can take values in. And you can generate valid inequalities that any such cut indicating y would satisfy and add them as constraints to your linear program. And this is one method of generating a linear program for max cut problem. Okay? Now let's just generalize this to arbitrary linear programs. What we did here, what in general we can do is take any input graph G and map it into a vector Vg in some capital N dimensions. Okay? And I'm not imposing any restrictions right now on the kind of map that you might end up using. Similarly, for every cut x, I'm going to obtain a vector Vx again in the same capital N dimensions. Again, no restrictions on how you obtain these maps from G to Vg and x to Vx. The only condition is that this map should be somewhat meaningful, in the sense that these maps should correspond to some linearization of the cut function. Meaning that for all inputs G and for all cuts x, if I compute the size of the cut in graph G indicated by x, then this should be equal to the inner product of these vectors, Vg and Vx. Okay? So long as you come up with a map that satisfies this linearization condition, I'm okay with it. Okay? And I'm going to admit this as a valid linearization. Okay? So we have done one step of getting a linear program. We have at least made the cut function linear, so I can think of optimizing this linear function. The next thing I need is what polytope or what set of inequalities am I going to maximize this linear function over. So I can choose any polytope P, again no restriction, so long as, again, it's a valid relaxation. Meaning that every vector Vx corresponding to a valid cut x should be contained in P. So long as you contain all the actual solutions, I'm okay with any such polytope. Okay? And then once you have such a polytope and such a linearization, the linear program you can think about is just maximize over all vectors W in this polytope the inner product of Vg with W. Okay? And now, since every Vx for all possible cuts is contained in this polytope P, clearly, let's define the value of this linear program as opt P of G, P being the polytope. Now, since every vector Vx corresponding to valid cuts is contained in this polytope P, opt P of G is at least opt of G. Okay? And our goal is to produce tight and tight linear programming relaxations, meaning that we would want in general that opt P of G in the worst case be close to opt of G as much as possible. Okay? Great. So now we want to measure the quality of our linear program. We want to say what kind of approximation does it achieve. So for this I'm going to define the notion of C, S approximation. We will say that this linear program that we wrote achieves C, S approximation is for every input graph G, where the optimal value of the max cut is at most small s, the linear programming relaxation returns an optimal which is at most small c. Okay? And the next thing I need to measure is what's the complexity of this linear program, or the size of the linear program. And I'm going to measure it as essentially the number of facets required to express P, number of linear inequalities required to define P. Okay? Great. So I hope it makes sense what it means to say arbitrary linear program for CSP. I'm going to mean this. Now let's just for a moment point out what's not so general about this. So here, observe that the polytope does not depend on the input instance G. Right? The polytope is independent. The input only plays a role in the objective function. And in some sense, what we are saying is that we are going to prove a lower bound against all possible linear programs where the input graph only affects the objective and not the polytope that you're optimizing over. Okay, and that's basically the restriction that we will pose. Okay.
That's a big restriction. You
That's
can want an algorithm that works on one end.
Yes.
You shouldn't sell it and then undersell it.
Yes, it is, I was right, and this is a huge restriction because in some sense, we could hope, in particular we could hope that by looking at the graph we could come up with a relaxation which is better.
That's not what I said. I said it's not a big restriction. You could hope for an algorithm, and that's normal algorithm. They work for every input. Of course you could.
It's a way of saying that you're not allowing any additional polynomial time computation beyond just the linear.
Yeah, like we want to
we
pre-process.
cannot rule any additional
Yeah.
without assumptions. We are just restricting to linear methods, and then it's no. It's a general.
No, I could
There's some
pre-process.
examples that don't fit this. For example, if you have a periodization for a peak, you would want to add constraints to the polytope that tell you that depending on what kind of edges you have in the graph. And so in that, you would want to say if there's an edge in the graph, those two guys can't be one at the same time. And that kind of constraint would not.
That would be a linear constraint. If you add this variable.
Or, we have two variables for the vertices. And you will add an equality between that tries to enforce that only one of them can be one. So I think that the reason why for MaxCut it's not a big restriction is because the solution space, like the set of assignments you have in mind, it doesn't depend on the distance. You look at all possible subsets, it doesn't. Whereas for independent set, like if you tell me the graph, then only certain solutions are better than the one graph.
So is a class that encapsulates these extensions, like hopefully, which is best one, you have a definition.
I think the one thing that works is if you think of it as a pre-processing thing, that first give you the edges of the graph, and then they don't tell you about the weights of the vertices, and then later, and now you're allowed to choose the polytope and some, depending on the graph.
But that's an arbitrary polynomial type of figure.
Yes. But now later I tell you the weights for the vertices, and now actually you can prove all points. Sometimes it's possible to avoid this.
Okay, let me just go through a little bit of history about where this whole idea of dealing with arbitrary linear programs came up with. Let me point out something explicitly here. This particular notion of an arbitrary linear program for CSP was defined in the paper of Chan, Lee, Raghvendra, and Stoiler. We're going to see this paper again because in some sense the whole result of this talk actually builds upon their work. But in general, the idea of understanding arbitrary linear programming realizations for combinatorial optimization problems was begun in this seminal work of Yamanakis from 1988. And it's sort of a funny story how it happened. Like at that point in time, they were efforts to prove P equals NP by designing a efficient algorithm for the traveling salesman problem. So the way some people were attempting it was by coming up with clever linear programming relaxations, and after defining the linear programming relaxations in some clever way, they wanted to argue that it actually exactly captures the TSP problem. So if you optimize over that polytope, you would basically be able to solve the TSP problem exactly. And I think a couple of iterations happened where Mihalis Yarkakish showed that the purported relaxations that solved the TSP problem were not good. But after a while it gets hectic, so he designed a general method to deal with all possible relaxations of the kind that people were coming up and to show a lower bound against all of them in one shot. It was in some way, he came up with the idea in some sense to defeat all these methods in just one go. And to do this, he defined this notion of extended formulations. We are not going to see the exact definition that he came up with here. You can think of it as basically this, what I defined is some kind of an extended formulation for CSP, but I won't go into too much detail other than that here. So basically in this paper in 1988, he showed an exponential lower bound for a certain restricted class of extended formulations, which he called symmetric extended formulations. And roughly what it means is that if I permute the vertices, say for the Maxwell problem, then the formulation shouldn't change. So it should be invariant under vertex permutations. And if you add this symmetric constraint, then you show an exponential lower bound for even the matching problem, which by the way has a polynomial time algorithm. And as a result, and in fact, as a corollary, he showed a similar exponential lower bound for the Krabbe-Salesman problem too, defeating all those methods to solve TSP in polynomial time using these relaxations. And he left open the question of whether this symmetry is in fact an important consideration at all. In fact, he conjectured that it is not. It took 20 years to settle this question that he asked in the paper, and it was settled in this breakthrough work of Fiorini et al. So Fiorini, Massad, Pokuta, Tiwari, and De Wolf in 2012 proved a 2 to the square root n lower bound on general extended formulations for the TSP problem. And basically this was shot in the arm of this area recently. Like a lot of results came out after this paper came out. In particular, I basically note a couple papers that would be somewhat relevant to us. So this paper of Braun, Fiorini, Pokuta, and David defined the notion of extended formulation for approximation problems. So the notion of Yanatakis only dealt with problems which were, we were trying to solve them exactly. But the notion of linear programming relaxations or arbitrary LPs for approximation problems were defined by BFPS. And in the same paper they showed a lower bound of 2 to the n to the epsilon for the size of any LP that achieves a n to the half minus epsilon approximation for the Cleek problem. This n to the half minus epsilon was later improved to the optimal n to the 1 minus epsilon in the work of Mart and Ankur Moitra. And the question of Yanatakis was completely resolved in a recent breakthrough work by Rothfuss, who basically showed a 2 to the theta n size lower bound for arbitrary extended formulations for the perfect matching problem. So this settles the question that Yanatakis asked, that the symmetry is really not important, and he gets essentially the same lower bound. And the work that is of most relevant to us today is this paper of Siwon Chan, James Lee, Prasad Raghvendra, and David, who showed a n to the log n over log n, so roughly quasi-poly lower bound, for approximating CSPs. So basically, in this result, in this main result that I've written here, they showed the same statement, except this 2 to the n to c was roughly quasi-poly. And our work is basically improving this quasi-poly lower bound to a sub-exponential lower bound. Okay? So, not only did this paper prove a quasi-poly lower bound for approximating CSPs, it also designed a very nice technique, in fact, to prove something stronger. What they showed was that arbitrary linear programs are in fact no more powerful than explicit linear programs from a particular linear programming hierarchy called as the Sherali-Adams hierarchy. So in some sense, they not only showed limitations of arbitrary linear programs, they in fact showed that they were no better than comparable sized linear programs from a very explicit hierarchy of relaxations. So in some sense, if we understand that hierarchy, then we understand arbitrary linear programs. And known lower bounds for this particular hierarchy then were translated into lower bounds for arbitrary linear programs in this paper. Okay? And we are going to follow the same general methodology, except that the main contribution would be to strengthen this relation between arbitrary linear programs and these linear programs arising out from the Sherali-Adams linear programming hierarchy. Okay? Great. So, time for me to write something. Okay. So, I'm going to get into some more details of the proof. If I begin 5 minutes late, then I should have roughly 25 minutes, I expect. So I hope to give you more or less a a rough understanding of at least the outline of the proof. Let's see how much we can cover. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, to have some concrete statement to prove in mind, let's just restrict our attention to the max cut problem. Okay, so our goal is going to be to show that no, let's say 2 to the n to the 0.001 size LP achieves in other words, for max cut, our C is this 1 minus epsilon, so something close to 1, and S is something close to half. Okay? So, let's think about this for a minute. We are basically given a task of trying to prove a lower bound against a linear program that we don't know. We have no idea about the linear program. We still want to show that it cannot achieve a certain approximation guarantee. In fact, anything better than what the random assignment does for this problem. How can we actually do this? And in fact, a very neat method to analyze arbitrary linear programs was devised in the work of Yanagakis himself. And over the years, this method has been refined and like various variants of it have been proposed which are useful. Okay, we are going to see one variant in a moment. And for this, I'm going to define, I'm going to start with a definition. Basically, the idea would be that for every problem, I can define a canonical matrix, right, which in some sense is determined by the problem itself, such that there is a simple linear algebraic parameter of this matrix called as a non-negative rank, which completely determines the size of the most efficient external formulation that achieves a certain approximation for the problem. Okay? That's a mouthful, so let me go a little bit slowly and explain what I mean. So I'm going to, our focus is the max cut problem, so I'm going to define a matrix associated with the max cut problem. Okay? And basically for this goal of achieving CS approximation. So I'm going to define, let me know if I'm writing to like the letter set timing and it's not visible. So let's define IS, the script IS, as a set of all input instances such that the max cut value of this instances is at most small s. Okay? I'm going to define a matrix M script IS. The rows of this matrix are going to be indexed by the set of instances in the script IS. The columns are going to be indexed by all possible cuts, and n is fixed here. So this is a non-uniform model. I'm allowed to write a new LP for every n. If that comment doesn't make sense, then you can ignore it. So n is fixed here.
I sub S is G, consists of,
I sub S is a set of all graphs G on n vertices.
and then the next I sub S is same, rows is,
Yeah. The rows are going to be indexed by elements of I sub S.
oh, graphs, okay.
Yes, so it's graphs in I sub S. And columns are going to be indexed by elements of the hypercube, the n-dimensional hypercube, which are like cuts. So basically, the rows are graphs, and the columns are cuts, right? And the G comma x set entry of this matrix is just going to be C minus the size of the cut indicated by x in the graph G. Okay? Now let's remind ourselves that G of x is at most opt of G of x, which is at most S, which is at most C, which means that C minus G of x is always non-negative. Okay? Which means that the matrix I've defined has all of its entries non-negative. For such matrices, I can define a parameter known as a non-negative rank. So non-negative rank of a matrix, of a non-negative matrix, M is the least integer R such that there are non-negative rank 1 matrices R1 so on up to R small r, which sum to the matrix M. Okay? And let me just make a note that if I don't have this non-negativity constraint on the rank 1 matrices, then this is just the usual rank of matrix M. So it's just imposing an additional restriction on the rank 1 factors that you can produce in the decomposition of M. And in particular, this implies that the non-negative rank of M for any matrix M is at least its rank. Okay? So with this definition, we can now go back to this issue of a simple parameter describing the size of arbitrary LPs for the Maxwell problem that achieves C, S approximation. If I write here, it's not going to be visible, right? Okay. Let me write here. So here is a K. So some version of it was by Yannakakis. I think the closest version to us is by CLRS. And this basically says that
This board is not movable.
that board is not movable.
It seems right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, that's why I'm not writing here. It's okay, right?
Is that no, just say no. It's not movable.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so basically, okay, so suppose the LP that we define achieves C, S approximation. Then size of LP must be omega of the non-negative rank of this matrix M script IS that we have. Okay? Basically, this what is claimed, and this is not that hard to prove. And it is an application of Furter's lemma, if you know what that is. It's not important to go to the proof here. Basically, what it's telling us is that if we can prove a lower bound on the non-negative rank of this explicit matrix that we define, at least a completely determined by the problem matrix that we define, then we also get a lower bound on the size of arbitrary LPs that achieve C, S approximation. So remember that C, S played a role in the definition of the matrix. So the instances were all that had optimal value at most S, and the entries were dependent on this.
Was there an example which is very far from each other, or is close to? So what's the relation with that?
Oh, you mean this omega?
Yes.
It's basically type. The reason I'm not writing type is because I'm only taking a subset of instances. There is a version you can define for all possible instances, and then it is typed. So this is actually a characterization, but we only need the lower bound, so I'm going to state the simple version. Okay? Okay, great. So which means that for our goal reduces to just lower bounding the non-negative rank of this matrix MIS. Okay? So now let me outline. Okay. Okay. Right. So the top box is our goal. We wanted an LP size lower bound. Through this characterization of Yannakakis and later people, we have reduced the problem to proving a lower bound on the non-negative rank of this matrix M subscript IS. Okay? And so basically till now, all we have done is the same as the approach that CLRS followed. From here, we are going to depart. Okay? So our goal is to analyze the non-negative rank of this matrix. Now, I'm calling this matrix explicit, but in some sense, for analysis purposes, it's not that explicit. I don't know the entries of this matrix. I just know in some sense what its rows and columns are, but I don't have handle on the entries of this matrix or any special kind of structure in the matrix. So to lower bound this quantity, therefore, what I want to do is find a submatrix of M script IS, which in some sense is additional structure that helps me in analysis. and hopefully lower bound the non-negative rank of that matrix. But if I lower bound the non-negative rank of a submatrix of MIS, then I would also get a lower bound on this matrix that I'm concerned about, right? So the matrix I'm going to use is, so I'm going to define the kind of matrix that I'm going to use, also describe its structure. And, I'm not going to prove, so I'm going to first define the structure of this matrix. I'm going to define a general class of matrices. Then I only hand wave the part where I claim that this matrix can be, that the matrix I define could be found as a submatrix inside this matrix. And then focus on proving the non-negative rank lower bound for that submatrix, because that's like the crucial part in the proof, for which I have 15 minutes. Okay, so this is a crucial definition. It has been made in communication complexity. In fact, our goal is to define a matrix with a certain kind of structure that aids in the analysis through methods in communication complexity. Okay, so a pattern matrix M sub f is parameterized by a function f, which is a non-negative function on the n-dimensional part of Q. Okay, and so let me define. There is also so let me define the pattern matrix for you now. What you're going to do is you start from this function on n bits, and you convert it into a two-party function. So right now it's a function of a single input. We want to make it closer to a communication game where two parties are trying to compute a certain function. We will do this using a gadget G. So this gadget G would be a function of a pair of B bits that produces a single bit. So it takes two B-bit inputs and outputs a single bit. Okay? And for convenience, we're going to denote this -1 to the V hypercube by just capital sigma. Okay? So using this gadget G, we can define a two-party function in the following way. This is going to be obtained by a composition of F with G operated n times. So let me define this for you. Let's call this H. The input to H is going to be a pair xy from sigma to the n comma sigma to the n. So each x and y live in capital sigma to the n. And H of xy is obtained in the following way. So, so I basically take the corresponding bits of x and y. So I take x1, y1 here, x2, y2 here, so on up to xn, yn. Then I apply g to these pairs. Each of these G produces a single bit output. Let's call the output of G Z1, Z2, so on up to Zn. Then you apply F to these Zs. Okay? So this gives me a function made using F and this gadget G, which is a two-party function. It takes two n-sized inputs from this larger alphabet sigma. Okay? And I can define the corresponding communication matrix MF of xy as just the xy, and again this is going to be indexed by, the rows and columns are going to be indexed by sigma to the n. And the entry is going to be given by just h of x comma.
So if you use some really simple functions here, I can basically get back like classical communication complexity stuff. Like if I use ors and ands, I should get set disjointness or something.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that's a great point. So this pattern matrix, I was coming to it. This pattern matrix method is so studying this block composition kind of functions is actually a major goal in communication complexity. And there are like tons and tons of extremely cool results where people analyze some. So the goal in communication complexity when studying such composed functions is to relate some communication measure of this composed function with some complexity measure of the function f itself. Okay, so I think the first paper in this line is due to Raz and Mackenzie from maybe 1997, and they showed that the deterministic communication complexity of this composed function with some suitable gadget. So okay, so all the results will be for some suitable G. G is a design choice. The deterministic communication complexity of this composed function is related to the decision tree complexity of f. And there are like several results that followed in some sense a similar theme. For example, quantum communication complexity is related to the approximate degree of f. So it's the degree of the polynomial that approximates the function everywhere within epsilon. And there are other methods, for example, other results like this, like for example, a bunch of Shestow's papers which prove such a relationship between, say, sign rank of a matrix and the threshold degree of the corresponding function f, and so on. So let me just, this is due to Rasborough. Shestow, sign rank, PDF degree, and so on. And in some sense, the most relevant work in this line for us, which inspired this result, is the work of Goose, Lovett, Meka, Watson, and Zuckerman, who showed for various one-sided measures of communication complexity a relationship to a certain definition of Hunter degree that we're going to see soon. Okay? And it's nice to sort of see exactly what we want in terms of this table, right? Remember that we are going to be interested in the non-negative rank of this pattern matrix. Maybe I forgot to tell you the name of which matrix is the pattern matrix, but this MF, X, Y that we defined, the communication matrix of the two-party function that we defined using the gadget G, is the matrix we are going to think about. And we are concerned with the non-negative rank of MF, and we want to relate it to certain complexity measure of the function f.
Wait, why are we considering the non-negative rank of MF? I thought I was considering the non-negative rank of M sub IS.
Yes, and without giving you the details, I skipped about there. So basically, this is going to be a general result.
So M sub F is supposed to be able to pick F and
Yes,
and
so there
maybe
is
also G, so that M sub F is a submatrix of M sub IS.
correct. Yes.
Okay, but it's not so clear to me exactly what I get to pick here, right? So this Hunter degree thing seems to say that like I don't get to pick G, right?
No. They are all for suitable G, so they're not for all G.
Yeah, so it's not obvious that the G that my Hunter degree theorem tells me I have to use is going to be usable to get
Yeah, not obvious.
get M sub F to be a submatrix,
Yes.
right?
No, but it is submatrix no matter what G you use. I mean, as long as it's a small.
Okay, yeah, that's
So that somehow these gadgets correspond to some constructional graphs that I can use to produce graphs that give me the right rows of M sub IS.
Yeah, they correspond to a gadget on graphs that you can add to.
Okay, no, and somehow no matter what Boolean function I use G, I can make a
yes,
alternative.
because you can do it for selection. I think you can do it for every function.
What's that?
Because F will be
Yeah,
F will be the
polynomial for X.
for the hard Shirley Adams instance.
Okay, and in the somehow B is now going to tell me about my instance size blow up because that's some gadget.
Yes.
If I pull all the way back to graphs, that's going to tell me
Yes.
some gadget that I have to embed in
Yes.
the graphs.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so the kind of theorem I'm looking for is something that's going to relate the non-negative rank of MF with certain complexity measure of F. Okay? So, quickly right here. Okay? First of all, it turns out to be, it turns out, so I'm trying to guess what parameter should I be using. It turns out easy to relate rank of this pattern matrix MF, for in fact most gadgets, it turns out to be easy to get rank of MF with so basically I think we can show that it is exponential in the degree of F as a polynomial. Okay? So I'm not going to qualify the statement for most okay? And in some sense, and this is well known, etc. So we want to go to non-negative rank, and what we will actually encounter, so for N and R.
So rank is a lower bound on the negative rank, right?
Yeah, it's a very bad lower bound. In some sense, like the setting we were concerned with, the rank is always going to be small n.
So the degree of F is very small then?
Yeah.
Oh, that sucks. Okay, so that's good.
The non-negative rank of MF.
Wait, why is the degree of F small? Because
Because F is measuring inside of it.
I didn't tell you what the F is, but basically F is going to be, for example, the Maxwell polynomial. It's just degree 2.
Okay, so you don't get to pick F really.
Yeah, we don't get to pick F.
If you want for the pattern matrix to turn out to be a submatrix of
Yes.
no IS.
Yes.
Okay, and so F is way too simple. So the goal is that you use this G to make F hard to compute by two parties.
Yes. In fact, all the extended combination lower bounds establish a separation between rank and non-negative rank.
Okay.
They are interesting because you are trying to prove, in fact, a large separation between the non-negative rank and the rank of the corresponding matrix. Okay, so we are going to relate it to some degree of F. Let me quickly define what this degree is. So degree plus of F, or non-negative degree. So F has degree plus D at most D if there exists non-negative D juntas. So D juntas are functions of just D variables out of N. Okay, so if there exists non-negative D juntas H1 so on, Hi such that F is the sum of H. Okay, so if F can be written as a sum of non-negative D juntas, D junta being a function that depends on only D variables, then we say that the degree of F is equals D, and D is the smallest, the degree is then the smallest D for which such a statement holds. Okay, and so the main theorem is a relationship between the non-negative rank of this matrix MF and this non-negative degree of the function F. Okay? And you should compare it with the degree measure. You can think of degree as so F has degree T if it can be written as a linear combination of monomials of size at most D. Here we are replacing monomials by non-negative functions, so they have to be D juntas, and the combination, the coefficients of the combination also have to be non-negative. So it's basically just the non-negative version of the polynomial. And we are saying that if you go from rank to the non-negative version of it, then you go from degree to the non-negative version of it. And that's the claim. And once we have this, I can state the main theorem, main technical theorem. Right. Okay, so we set parameters for B at least, let's say 10 log n. So, for yeah, so remember that B was log of the size of sigma. B was the log. Okay. So for any B which is larger than some logarithmic in n, and G the gadget Boolean inner product function, I'll define this in a moment. N and R of this composed function of this matrix MF is size of sigma to omega degree plus of F plus something else. Is this part this one? Okay, Okay, so the main technical theorem that we actually show is a relationship between the non-negative rank of this pattern matrix MF and the non-negative degree of this function f. Okay, so let me point out what exactly is going on here. It is easy to show the following upper bound. So an exponential upper bound in the non-negative degree of f is not that hard to show. And what we are showing is in some sense a more or less tight statement on the lower bound side. What we are showing is that, okay, so the upper bound holds, and for the particular gadget G, which is the Boolean inner product, let me define it here. So remember that G is a function of pair of B bits, and it's just for each of the pair of corresponding bits, you take their AND, so 0, 1 AND, sum them up and take mod 2. If you have not seen the Boolean product, maybe this definition will help. It's not important, just think of it as some function if you don't know this already. But basically for some particular function, particular gadget G, we can show that this upper bound is more or less tight up to this additive loss here. So degree of, instead of degree plus of f, we get a degree plus of slight shift of f. Notice that if I add a slight positive quantity to f, you would expect the degree to decrease because the function is becoming more positive. So that's one loss here. And there is some, of course, some constant factor loss here. So up to constant factors in the exponent here and this additive error here, this is actually tight.
For the lower bound, does it not depend on n? Sorry, the upper bound. I would expect that you need to send log n bits per.
I think it's sort of captured here because b has to be at least log n.
Sure.
B is the log of the size of signal.
It would only be a stronger advantage, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let me just end with a comparison. This is the main theorem. My plan, of course, was to show a little bit about the proof, but we can't. So let me just compare this with, so one can sort of see the previous proof of CLRS and also the GLMWZ paper, which worked on the communication side of the same problem. They were both, in some sense, proving a similar relationship between some version of non-negative rank and some version of non-negative degree of the function. Let me tell you how they differ. So both CLRS and GLMWZ, instead of showing non-negative rank lower bound, their methods actually end up showing a lower bound for approximate non-negative rank. Okay? So what's approximate non-negative rank? It's the lowest non-negative rank of any matrix which is pointwise close within some epsilon, additive error of epsilon. So instead of MF, I can take any matrix obtained by perturbing any entry by epsilon, so long as it is still positive, and then take the minimum amongst all such matrices of the non-negative rank of them. That's the approximate non-negative rank of MF. And all these methods actually establish this relationship between not just non-negative rank but also the approximate non-negative rank. And instead of degree, therefore, what ends up happening is you get approximate non-negative degree. Okay? And the relationship between approximate non-negative degree and approximate non-negative rank is tight. The issue, despite this tightness, is that for CSPs we cannot hope to use such a theorem to prove the lower bound that we need. The reason is that the approximate degree for CSP is really small. Okay? So the epsilon approximate degree of this function f, which I did not show you, but which is the function that we need to use, is just logarithmic in 1 over epsilon. Which means that if you actually end up, if you actually work with approximate non-negative rank, you will never end up with a lower bound, which is better than exponential in log 1 over epsilon. And therefore, previous results could never, in some sense, such methods can never hope to show a sub-exponential lower bound. And we get away by that by actually getting a method to lower bound the non-negative rank instead of the approximate non-negative.
So actually, I should think of them not being able to go past like quasi-poly, right?
Yes.
Wait, so now I'm confused. So this is not actually a method?
This is the method, yes. I was comparing it to CLRS and
Well, you could not do better than that.
yeah, so I was
Which was some
trying.
other measure.
Huh?
Which was some other measure?
Yes, so okay, so then let me repeat in this way, right? So the previous methods also obtained some lower bound for CSP, but they could not go beyond quasi-poly. And I'm trying to point out what's the reason for why they get stuck at quasi-poly while we can get away with sub-exponentials. The reason is that their methods not only try to bound the non-negative rank, they in fact end up bounding approximate non-negative rank, right? And the issue with CSP is that the approximate non-negative rank actually is very tight. And therefore we really need to work with non-negative rank, and that's sort of the main thrust of this work. So both the communication complexity side, the GLMWZ paper, and the CLRS paper end up working with approximate non-negative rank, and we end up getting a method to lower bound the non-negative rank instead. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there.